welcome to the channel, or welcome back to the channel. Today we have an exciting video that we've been wanting to share. Welcome to the story time of the birth of our second daughter. Because of some of those same complications and because of just my medical history and talking to my team, we decided to do a planned induction this time. So I literally had her the same time that I had my first daughter, which was 38 weeks and 3 days, but this time it was planned. So time we knew we were going in, so it was a little bit more calm like because we could plan it. So throughout that last week, and it was actually good being our second baby, it was good because we could kind of prep with our first daughter. So our first daughter is 2.5, and so we knew, and the way my hospital works with planned inductions, at least, I think this might be similar in most hospitals because I've heard it, but some hospitals might do it differently, is they have you come in late the night before and kind of start your labor in the middle of the night, start the Pitocin or whatever in the middle of the night, and then you basically have your baby the next day. So we knew our induction was scheduled for June 28th, but it was scheduled for like literally midnight.
Yeah.
And so
Which
we
was
knew
literally the day after, yeah.
Yeah, so we knew that we would be having our daughter sometime on June 20, leading up to the induction. Since we knew the date, we had our last NST. If you guys don't know what an NST is, it's basically
a non-stress test.
Yeah, a non-stress test in pregnancy. I think if you're not high risk, you get one non-stress test around 35 weeks. And the way non-stress tests work is they hook you up to a monitor. You guys have seen it. I'll link a picture, but I know you've seen it if you've been pregnant or probably even with other people. But there's 2 monitors on your stomach. One monitors contractions and one monitors the baby's heartbeat. And basically in a non-stress test, they hook you up on that for about 20 to 30 minutes. And in order to pass the non-stress test, I think you have to have 3 accelerations, and they also monitor your contractions just to make sure that you aren't in labor, like early labor and stuff like that. Like I said, in a non-high-risk pregnancy, I believe you have 1 non-stress test at 35 weeks, and if you pass it and there's no other complications, you're good to go. But in a high-risk pregnancy, depending on the high risk, you can start, usually they like to do non-stress tests once a week or twice a week, depending on how high risk you are. And they usually start you, it depends on what your high-risk situation is, but they usually start you anywhere between like 25, 28 weeks, and then they'll do it until your induction or until the end of your pregnancy. But basically what I'm saying is, before our induction, we went to our last NST. So I had NSTs this pregnancy 2 times a week from we started them about 32 weeks, all the way till I got induced at 38. So my last my last NST was like 2 or 3 days before the induction. So they did that, and then because they knew I was being induced, so our daughter was born on, what day of the week was that? Saturday, yeah. Saturday. So because they knew I was being induced that Friday midnight, I think my last NST was like that Tuesday. They did the NST, she passed the NST, and then they did blood work for so they didn't have to do as much tests. So whatever test was going to take longer, whatever tests were going to take longer, they did those blood work in preparation for the fact that they knew I was coming in Friday night for an induction. And they basically told me, unless your water breaks beforehand or unless you get contractions that are close together beforehand, this is when you're coming in for your induction. And the like rules or like things they told me to do before induction was basically just rest, make sure you're here, and they didn't really give me anything because it wasn't like a scheduled C-section. It was a Pitocin induction, which is what I had with my first, and I don't mind them much. So
from the support person perspective, this is all just like leading like to us getting to the hospital or right at the initial onset from like, so like just you mentioned earlier, we were there, we had to get there on June 29th, June 28th
at midnight.
Right before midnight. So basically, when midnight struck, it's June 29th. Yeah, it's 12:01.
Yeah, so they told us to get there. It was scheduled as like June 29th midnight, but you have to get there to fill out paperwork like half an hour before.
So make sure that we always have to have like our luggage packed and ready to go, and then make sure there was room in the trunk so that way there was no issue. And then once we get to the hospital, one of the main things after the parking of the car and stuff like that you have to take care of is like basic paperwork. So Justine checked herself in. There was nothing really for me to do then. But then they started this.
Well, that was a little different. That's the difference between the schedules. So basically, because we knew we were having the induction, the night before, the day before, I really just rested, which is something I didn't get to do with my first daughter because it wasn't planned and because it was more of a going in for this like emergency blood pressure and then ending up like finding out you were going to be induced that night. I hadn't rested, and that led up to like if you watch my first birth story, that's why I was so tired, and it all worked out in the end, but that's why I was so tired. Whereas this labor, I felt like even though it was hard work, I wasn't as exhausted because literally the night before, the whole day, Sam basically took care of the house, took care of our toddler, and I spent time with her in the morning as like my last day with my only child. And then I was doing the exercise ball. I was doing things to prep for labor, yes, but very light things. I did some pregnancy yoga, but I was basically doing like meditation the whole day. I didn't take calls for the day, and I just stayed very zen to try and like go into labor as peaceful as possible, because you guys know that was like the most important thing to me.
Yeah. And then so to add, like basically like when we got to the hospital and she checked herself in and everything, they gave us like not stacks of paperwork to fill in. That was just real basic. But they started, they have to give you.
Didn't you fill those out? I don't know.
Yeah, it was not really anything. It was just like make
basic
sure, like,
paperwork. Summertime is a busy time in labor and delivery. Well, they always say that, but my labor delivery team said they had a busy week that week. So even though we were scheduled for midnight, we actually had to wait because, like I said, we were a scheduled induction. So I wasn't in active labor, and there were people who were. So obviously they take priority, and there was no room or bed for us like when we first arrived. So I think we waited. I think we waited in the waiting room for about an hour. So we'll just relax some more. So by the time we got into a room, it was already like a little bit past 1 a.m.
And this is the labor and delivery. Yeah.
Yeah. So a little bit past 1 a.m. And so they really hadn't started anything yet. But then they take your history, like they ask you what support you have when you go home, things like that. They just take your medical history, why are you being induced, blah, 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 introduce you to your birth team. And then what they did the first time, then I think they checked me to see if I was dilated at all, which I actually was dilated the same amount that I was with my first daughter, which is funny. So I was already dilated 3 centimeters. So with my first daughter, they put in a Foley bowl. If you guys don't know what that is, it's a little silicone thing that they fill with water to kind of help you dilate more. But my nurse this time decided that usually the Foley bulb is to get you to 4 centimeters. But my nurse this time decided, like, you dilated really, really well in your first labor. You're already 3 centimeters. I don't think we need the Foley bulb. If we start the Pitocin and you don't dilate well, we'll rethink about the Foley bulb. But right now, you're already 3 centimeters, so we'll see how you do without the Foley bulb. And I didn't need it, so that was good. Not needing that, not having that, because insertion without the epidural was painful my first labor, and insertion, and then it just adds to interventions and things like that. So I didn't mind not getting it this time. I was actually happy when she said, like, I don't think you need it.
And like Joe, from the jump, once you get into the room and the nurses, whoever pretty much comes in, PAs are physician assistants, right? You ask questions for things you don't understand, and then it's important to know ask questions for things that you may need clarification or what the patient needs clarification on, because Justine's not afraid to ask questions, but in the unlikeliest event she may be too tired to ask any questions, you have to keep that in mind.
Sometimes when you're in labor too, you're just focused on the labor and you're not yourself, so you're not going to ask the questions you would ordinarily ask in other situations. So that's why you want to choose your support person wisely. And obviously, like for us, we choose to only labor with us, like as a team, as a couple, but other people have other people in the room, so whoever you have in the room, make sure that you talk to them about also advocating for you. But yeah, so once they checked me, they knew I was 3 centimeters. We chose not to do the Foley bulb. By then it was already almost 2 before we even ever got Pitocin. So around a little bit after 2 was probably when I got started with the actual Pitocin. I was already getting Braxton Hicks pretty consistently, even in the car on the way to the hospital, but I was getting pretty consistent, pretty painful Braxton Hicks for like 2 weeks leading up to my induction. I actually kind of almost didn't think I was gonna make it to my induction, and then I did. But even leading in the car, I was getting really painful Braxton Hicks that were coming close together. So I really feel like if I wasn't induced, I still think my water would have broke, or I would have went into spontaneous labor within a few days, no more than 39 weeks. But that's not safe for me because my blood pressure has a tendency to rise after 38 weeks, and it was already starting to show signs of that. So I'm still glad we went with the 38-week induction. But you know, I was already getting the reason I'm saying I was already getting Braxton Hicks is because I was already getting contractions before they hit put the Pitocin. But then, yeah, my contractions started up more with the Pitocin, but they really weren't bad at this point in the labor. And that kind of goes the same as my first labor. A lot of people say Pitocin contractions are worse than regular. I have nothing to compare it to because both of my labors were Pitocin. But for me, until I get into active labor, it's really not that bad. It's really pain I can take. With my first daughter, I made it all the way to 8 centimeters before I got an epidural. We'll get into what happened with the epidural and all of that this time because it is the big part of the story. But anyway, the point is, when they started the Pitocin, the contractions did start and they were consistent, but they weren't too painful, so I was still able to relax and kind of felt like you feel like when you're starting a period. It's kind of like the level of pain, I would say, at that point. And then, did I sleep this time?
Not really. I mean,
I was so rested this time. It wasn't, so last time I didn't sleep because of pain. This time I didn't sleep because I had slept all the day prior because I knew I was going in for planned induction. So by the time I got to labor, I was pretty awake. And so this labor was only about 9 hours, so it went way quicker than my first labor. My first labor was like 18 hours.
So literally half the time.
Which was what my doctor projected. So once I got that first dose of Pitocin, they basically level it up every, I think, a half hour. So as they continued to level it up, we were just relaxing in the room, talking. The contractions did get more intense, but I was still good. I think we watched a movie at that point. I was relaxing. And then they decided to just do an ultrasound. Usually when you're getting an induction, they do an ultrasound to make sure, I believe just to make sure everything's good, baby's in good position. And baby girl had been head down since about 30 weeks. Since about 30 weeks. Eleanor had been head down since about 30 weeks.
Yeah.
However, when they did the ultrasound, they told me that she was still head down, but she was like head down and to the left, I believe.
Yeah, like she was like crooked, like she was like slanted.
Head down and to the
like she was kind of like a little bit tucked in.
Right, and like I really didn't, I guess you know it in your head, but I really never thought about the fact that like in order to give birth vaginally, your baby needs to be head down and centered. I really never gave thought to like if they're not exactly centered, but they had told me that in a few ultrasounds, like, oh yeah, she's head down, she's a little to the side, but they never said anything about it. They never made it a big deal, so I never thought anything about it. So when they did the ultrasound in labor and delivery during the induction, they were like, well, she's still head down, a little to the left. Let's watch it. At first, they didn't make a big deal of it. They were like, let's watch it because babies obviously do move as they're moving through the birth canal. So within a couple hours, she might be more centered. So at first, I didn't think anything of it. I thought she would move, and she was moving around like during labor, during the contractions. And then the contractions were ramping up, but like I said, it was a very like peaceful labor in the sense that there was really no, I was just breathing through the contractions this time, like, and they actually, my contractions, I could say, like, I'm trying to think, like, I got to, like, at this point, I got to, like, 5 centimeters. Like, they checked me again. It was a couple hours, 5 centimeters. But I remember being in more pain with Anna by 5 centimeters. So I still felt like the contractions weren't that bad. And my plan was the same as my first daughter. I was going to labor without an epidural unless I needed it or until I needed it. So at this point, they were like, do you want epidural? You're now like 4 or 5 centimeters. And I was like, no, the contractions are still good. I think about 3 hours went by before the second ultrasound.
It was 4 a.m. So
Yeah,
2 hours.
2 hours. So then 2 hours later, after the first ultrasound, again, I was like 5 centimeters at this point. They had pushed the Pitocin, so contractions were ramping up, but I still wasn't in massive pain. I could feel them for sure, and I had to breathe through them, but I was still good, and I was still like confident that I could. But when they came in and redid the ultrasound, they said she was still head down and to the left and hadn't moved. And they said she was a little bit less left, but still to the left. And at that point, they got concerned because it was at the point where they wanted to be able to break my water. Sometimes when you're induced, your water does not break naturally and they have to break it. My water was broken with my first daughter as well. The issue is if the baby was, so they explained to us at that point, the nurses came in, the doctor came in, like a team came in and kind of said, hey, so we're doing a second ultrasound and we still see that she's head down and sideways and didn't move on her own. This is what that means. And they came in and they basically said that when a baby is not centered and you break the water, or even if the water breaks spontaneously, if the baby is head down but not centered, the placenta, it was something else, the placenta and something else. The sac, I think the placenta and the sac, or the placenta or the sac, either one, but they were mostly concerned about the placenta can deliver before the baby, and in that case, it would become like a very, very emergency C-section.
Yeah, and there was the wrinkle in this pregnant. That was the wrinkle. Like
in our birth story.
Yeah, in our birth story, that was it.
So in that moment, like they explained to us that would be a very, very emergency section and what that meant, and they were very concerned that I didn't have an epidural. My nurses and my care team knew that I wanted to try and labor without the epidural, and they had no issue. They were really, really supportive
yeah,
up until this point.
Yeah.
Kind of up until this point, because they said that if you didn't have the epidural in, when you have the epidural already in, if you go for an emergency C-section, I believe they can like turn it into the spinal tap that numbs you for the C-section, where you stay awake, they cut you and all that stuff, especially in an emergency, like it needs to be done quick, obviously. But if you don't have an epidural in, they explained that you would have to go under general anesthesia, and that's very dangerous during labor. It's not safe. It's not, well, I'm not gonna say it's not safe because it happens and people are fine, but like it's way more risky to baby and mom to go under general anesthesia. But if you don't have the epidural in, that's the only option. And they also explained that like Sam wouldn't be able to be in the room if I had to go under general anesthesia.
Right, that's what I was gonna say. So like, if she had denied the epidural and they had to put on the general, they would literally have to rush her out of the room if something went wrong, and I would be sitting there like wondering, because
no one can go in on the general, only local.
Yeah.
Because general has to be like completely sterile, and because it's so emergent, and because they would have to get the baby out so quickly, because me being put to sleep like puts so much risk, and it was just too much risk. Whereas if I had the epidural, it would still be an emergency if that was to happen. Like if they broke my water and the cord ended up coming out first, it would still be an emergency, but he would be able to be in, like basically, we would prepare for it.
And so basically, like if she got the epidural, more support, and like it continued to be there. But if she didn't, and then something happened, then her support went from having it to completely zero. For however long she was going to be.
But they also knew that I did want to avoid the C-section. I wasn't happy when they said that, you know, this situation presented a possible emergency C-section, especially an emergency C-section. So they said basically what we're gonna do is we can do like an external inversion. So an inversion, usually people know it as like the doctor sticking their hand up, in, and turning the baby. That's usually done when the baby's not head down at all. But in my case, the baby was head down, just not in the right position. So they did it externally, where they like push on your stomach, and then so they said like we can do an external inversion, hopefully move the baby, and then break your water, and hope that the whole like risk of the placenta doesn't happen. But then if it does happen, if you have the epidural, at least you're ready to go and we can do the emergency.
And they also recommended that to do the epidural like more so, because they said that this would be painful if you didn't.
Yeah, the inversion is very painful.
So
I mean, So inversions, I here they're very painful. So I ended up getting the epidural. We did talk about it. So in that moment, it was really hard for me because I really do think I could have done this labor without an epidural if this emergency didn't present itself. But in thinking about like, well, I was hoping like, okay, that's not gonna happen. Like a part of my brain was like, well, that's not gonna happen. We're gonna be fine, so I don't need the epidural. But the other part was like, they're saying that this is a possibility, so we need to prepare for the emergency that is like possibly in front of us, which is like really hard because you're like, well, it didn't happen, but they're saying that it's a chance of happening. And I did ask my care team, like, what is the chance of that? Like, you're saying it's a risk, but what is the percent chance? And they basically told me they couldn't give me a percentage because every woman's body is different how they react to that. So because I didn't have a percentage to go on, like they didn't tell me like, yeah, it's 80% that that's gonna happen and you're gonna end up in the OR, or it's like 10% and you could kind of take your chance. Because I didn't have like a number, a statistic, or like a percent that I could think through, I went with the epidural at that point basically for safety and to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. So that's basically what we did. So at that point, I told my care team that I'm gonna go ahead with the epidural, and then we can try the inversion and pray for the best and hope I don't end up with a C-section. And that's what we did. So then they called the anesthesiologist. Guys, if you're someone who wants an epidural, tell them like an hour before you actually think you're gonna need it, because when you say you want an epidural, even when you're in massive pain, because that happened when we had first birth, even when you're in massive pain and you want the epidural for your pain, the anesthesiologist is not just gonna show up. They take a while, like.
And especially in this example, because it was their busy time.
Yeah,
oh,
especially, but I wasn't an emergency because I wasn't in pain. He knew that I was getting it for the possible emergency.
They get backed up.
So basically, we told them we were gonna get the epidural and do the inversion and pray for the best, and then, you know, we relaxed. Labor was still continuing. They didn't break my water yet because we were waiting for the epidural and that whole situation and the team. And then about maybe an hour after that, 2 hours.
2 hours later they started.
2 hours? No, I'm talking about when the anesthesiologist came.
Oh yeah, that's like 1 hour.
Like an hour after the anesthesiologist did come, told us about all the risks, talked to us, and I explained to him why I was getting it, you know, whatever. He took my medical history. They did the epidural. Epidural's fast. It's, honestly, I'll tell the truth. Like, my first epidural, I got it because I was in massive pain at that point. I got my first epidural when I was 8 centimeters in full active labor, and then I only labored for like 2 more hours, pushed the baby. Like, it was, so when I got my first epidural, it was because I could not take the pain anymore. So I was in so much pain, I barely felt the epidural. This time, I wasn't in a lot of pain, and I didn't get the epidural for pain. I got it for this emergency situation. So I felt the epidural because I feel like the first time my body was so focused on how painful the contractions had become that I was listening to what the anesthesiologist had said to do, but I didn't feel the epidural because my contractions were outweighing the pain the first time. But in this second labor, I wasn't in massive pain, so it wasn't masking. The contractions weren't masking pain because they weren't that painful. So I did feel it. It's not that bad because it's really quick, but it's really deep in your spine, and I don't remember the first time it feeling like having the feeling like people say a bee sting and then a screw and then you feel it. Like, I didn't feel any of that the first time because I was in so much pain to begin with, and I think like my body had taken over mentally with that. But the second time, like I said, I wasn't in massive pain. I was getting it in case this emergency happened, so I did feel everything. But I mean, you have to do it because I didn't want to end up in an emergency and like alone in a C-section. That would have been my worst nightmare. So I didn't want to end up with that if the worst happened. But like I said, we were praying for the best but preparing for the worst. And I got the epidural. Then maybe like half an hour later, they had to assemble a whole team to do the inversion because it was basically, it was my main nurse, the doctor, like sonographer for the ultrasound, and 2 other people, like nurses, that were helping them.
And an additional doctor came in. And,
so,
and I think there were 2 other people who came in. It was one like to
a
watch.
student.
Yeah, like to watch.
I always okay students because I don't have an issue with students using me to learn. But they don't do anything. They were just watching.
Literally observing.
So the way the inversion or external inversion worked, if you want to know more about inversion, like You can look it up. I'll link something. But the way the external inversion board is going to work was that they had one person on my stomach doing the ultrasound to kind of see where the baby moved and make sure it worked. They had my main nurse, where was she? They had my main nurse like helping move the baby to the right position. Then they had the doctor like on top of my stomach pushing to the right direction. And then they had the two support people kind of like making sure everything was going good, and then the students were watching.
And folks,
I don't even know where you were.
I was sitting there because there was nowhere for
there was no space.
Because once you get into labor, in our example, our room was like the way they designed it is kind of like it's not small, but it's more like they give you the minimum,
I think that
they give you the minimum amount of space
because
possible.
of all the people that had to be there for that.
But basically, like I was in the corner and it's a little like I don't want to say jaw dropping, but more like. It's more like shocking because when you see the amount of people they did to do the inversion, it was insane. Like to see another doctor literally like put all their body weight like right on top of the stomach. It's like, are you already hurt on the baby? But then you realize like
no, you have to put that much pressure for the baby to actually move into the birth canal. But my point is, I didn't feel any of that because of the epidural. Like he said, if I would have chose to take my chances and do it without the epidural, not only if the umbilical cord, came through that we were in the worst, like we would have been in a worse situation, but I would have felt all that, and it's very painful from what I hear. But I can imagine it would be very painful. But I didn't feel any of it. I just felt a little pressure. I didn't feel any of it because the epidural had already kicked in at that point. It took about 10 minutes of them like maneuvering that.
Yeah, give it to
and then they said, okay, the baby actually is in a good position. It was still a risk, but we had to break the water and see. So at that point, because they knew they were going to break the water and because they knew there was this risk of the placenta delivering and me having to be rushed to C-section, they prepped for that. So they basically had everybody stand there in case, because they told me that if the umbilical cord came out, they would have to have one of the nurses hold it to make sure the baby stayed alive, all of that, and rushed to the C-section. So they had everybody kind of staged in case, and then the doctor broke the water. We kind of waited, and nothing happened. The water, the water broke. There was water everywhere like last time, and we waited a few seconds to make sure, and then nothing happened, and everybody kind of took a deep breath and said, okay, it worked. And emergency was over, and we thanked God and moved forward. So from that point on, we were out of the woods. We knew that we weren't going to need the emergency C-section, at least not for that. But we weren't going to need the emergency C-section because the umbilical cord didn't come out. They were able to successfully do the external inversion. Baby was now head down in the middle. Labor could progress. Water was broken, which usually when they break your water, your labor progressed quickly. Remember, this was my second labor. My first labor was 18 hours, but they say that that's pretty short for a first-time parent, actually. Yeah. And my doctor had warned me that she was projecting that because I had a fast labor in my first pregnancy, that my labor would be anywhere from, she was projecting 5 to 11 hours. It was about 9 hours. But yeah, we'll get more into it. But after they broke my water, it was quick, right?
Yeah, it just kind of went up to that. So basically, from when the anesthesiologist came to when they started with that, it was like it went from basically like 2 hours went really, really fast. So.
Yeah, so I don't even know what time that
was. It was like when that happened, it was like 6 a.m.
Yeah.
6 or 7 a.m. Yeah, 6 a.m.
So yeah, close to 7, like maybe 6:45. But it did ramp up the labor because then, even though I couldn't feel the pain anymore, I knew it ramped up the labor. Because I started like having a lot of pressure, because when you get an epidural, you can feel pressure, you can still feel your contractions. It's kind of weird. You can feel the pressure and contractions, but they're not like painful the way it is when you don't have an epidural. But it's not like you can't feel nothing. Mm-hmm. If you can't feel anything, to ask them to lower your epidural, because if it's too high, you're not going to be able to like labor correctly, because you're not going to know. You need to still be in tune with your body. So that's a little tip. But yeah, I could still feel the pressure, and I definitely felt like it was ramping up. And then my nurses were getting really excited because they were like, oh yeah, we're gonna have a baby soon. This labor though, I don't know when I started throwing up. like how long was it till I gave birth after that? But it definitely ramped up quickly and became kind of a blur.
Yeah, I think the first time it was like 6 or 7.
Basically,
no, 7 a.m. I think.
basically after my water broke, I noticed that I was getting a lot of pressure. The monitors showed that the contractions were going up really quickly, and then I started vomiting, and the nurses were like, oh yeah, once you start vomiting, we know you're in active labor and you're gonna have a baby soon. And like that happened with Anna, but I only threw up like maybe once. But with my second daughter in this labor, I kept throwing up, and because I only had eaten, I ate before we went into the induction, but it had already been several hours at this point. Basically I was like throwing up bile, which was terrible, but that kept happening for a couple of hours, and it just kept getting kind of more progressive. And they wanted, they knew my labor was progressing pretty quickly, so they wanted to progress me faster. And so my nurse offered the peanut ball. If you don't know what that is, I will link it, like a picture, but it's basically a ball that, it's not the exercise ball, it's a ball that kind of goes in between your legs and your pelvis to kind of open you up. And once I got that, I dilated pretty quickly.
Yeah.
That along with the Pitocin, along with breaking my water, like really sped up my labor. And I think that's why I went into active labor really quickly. I was like throwing up, and everything kind of became a blur. I know it was a few hours, but for me, that felt like maybe that whole thing felt like an hour. I know it wasn't, but so much was going on. And even though I couldn't feel the pain, I was like throwing up, feeling pressure, doing the peanut ball. Peanut ball was like dilating me very quickly. All this was going on. So it just went super, like it became a super blur, which like was very different than my first daughter, because her labor was so long that I remember it more intricately, because it wasn't a sped up thing. By the time we got to pushing, I was like, thank God, it'd been 18 hours. But with this labor, it was like progressing really quickly, and I couldn't even keep up with like everything. But I kept just breathing. I was still calm, but it was just very fast paced. And then I remember them coming in, checking. After I threw up a couple times, nurse was like, let me check you, because that means you're in active labor, and these contractions mean you're in active labor. And I believe I went from like a 5 to an 8. Yep. Pretty quickly.
Very quickly. Within the span of like 2 hours, something like that? 3 hours? Yeah, it was really quickly.
Like not even 2 hours.
Yeah, it was very
So
fast.
once that happened, I believe like I never like, they never checked me to a 10, but I know that she basically told, like, basically there was a point where the nurse was like, well, if you feel pressure, call. And then the doctor literally came in for maybe like 5 minutes, spoke to me, saw how I was doing, saw how I was progressing. He said he would be back. He went into a different labor, and within 20 minutes of all that happening, I felt pressure. And then the pressure was like building, and I called the nurse, but the doctor was in another labor. And when the nurse checked me, she didn't say I was 10 centimeters, but it was obvious I was 10 centimeters. I don't think I was crowning, but the baby was definitely in the birth canal and low, right? Mm-hmm. Were you watching?
Yes.
Like, could you see it, or you were?
When she was crowning?
No. When she, remember when she lifted up the thing and she was like, oh yeah, we need to call the doctor.
Yeah, you could see,
Yeah, so she lifted up the thing. I think she probably saw the baby's head. She was like, we need to call the doctor now. He was in another labor. Don't know what happened in that labor, but a midwife ended up coming, which I didn't have an issue with. And basically, my first daughter, I took like 3 hours to push her out. It was pretty difficult. Like, I think I just was like a first time mom, didn't know how to push. I think she just like progressed into the birth canal slower, but this labor, like I said, ramped up pretty quickly. And by then, like, I just started pushing, and it did take me like an hour, half an hour to push her out, but it was way easier to push her out. I was just more nervous to push her out. I was more nervous to push her out because I had gestational diabetes. There was a couple times where they told me like, your baby's gonna be big, or things like that. So I was preparing to have like a big baby, and my first daughter was only 6'12", and I don't consider that really big. It's not really big, but so I was like, oh my God, this time am I gonna be able to push her out? So that added to nerves, but I had to try to stay calm. But I was more nervous to push my second daughter out than my first, because they had said like, you might have a big baby, gestational diabetes, blah blah blah, all the risk. Turns out she was only 6'9", so she was actually smaller than my first daughter, but still healthy. Basically, I pushed her out in like a little bit less than an hour, and she was born at 12:05 in the afternoon.
Yeah. And then yeah. And
Yeah,
then,
perfectly healthy. They did have to check her sugar, because I had gestational diabetes. Her sugar was slightly low at birth, and then it was treated. It's treated like basically like a drink, like a sugar drink on the baby. If you guys don't know, I'm gonna do a full video on like my experiences with both high-risk pregnancies, so I'll get into it in a later video. But if you guys don't know, like gestational diabetes goes away for mom once the placenta is delivered. For baby though, they have to check baby for 24 hours, so they did that, and she was fine after that initial reading and treatment. This time I did have a little bit of trouble like delivering the placenta. Not trouble, but like it took a while.
It wasn't doing it on its own. Like she would push, but it wasn't coming out. Like
with Anna, I didn't even push.
Exactly.
With my first daughter, they pushed on my stomach like twice. It came out. This time, they tried pushing on my stomach. It didn't work. I tried. They told me to push a little bit. It didn't work. The midwife basically has to kind of like get it started slowly, and then it came out.
Yeah, like she literally had to like, so after I cut the cord, and you know, she basically like it wasn't coming, so she had to like take what was after the cord was cut, like take the rest of it, like, and basically like slowly pull on it without tearing it, because if you tear the whatever's left of the cord and the placenta stays inside, then we have a different problem. So she was going very slowly, like guiding it out, and then she would stop a minute, and then she would have Justine push for a little bit to see if it could actually still try to come out. But when it didn't, she would again go slowly, like by pulling on the cord, like to get it out, like very
not pulling,
not really pull, but like it's like she would like, I'm doing this because she literally like was rolling her fingers to try and get it out like this, to slowly get it out. So that's what happened there.
So it turns out, I think one of the, I don't know what they're called. Like
I forgot the specific name.
The specific name that like of that part of your placenta that kind of attaches or something. Mine was longer than
the average.
Was that. But basically, baby girl was born healthy after that. Like I said, this labor was way quicker, ramped up quicker. Basically went with what they always say about second labors, which is that they're faster and things go quicker. So definitely I would prepare for that if you are a second time or third time parent, because it was more of a blur. And even though I did stay calm and it was still a calm, serene labor like I wanted, it was a little bit harder to stay calm, just not to stay calm because I wasn't anxious in that way, but like to keep up because things weren't moving as slowly. So I wasn't able to like it's more foggy than the first because there was so much going on so quickly. But it's kind of good because who wants to be in labor for 24 hours? Like I said, I was healthy, she was healthy. We literally stayed in the hospital for a day and that's it. So there was a little bit of hiccups, but luckily everything worked out.
Do you want to talk about the postpartum in a different video?
Yeah.
Okay, just wondering. Okay, keep going.
So basically, that was the hiccup in our labor, and a lot of people that situation happens to do end up having to have emergency C-sections, so I'm thankful that we didn't, but that's it. She was born healthy, and that is our birth story with our second daughter. If you guys have any other questions about our labor or delivery, since we didn't shoot like an actual vlog, I am willing to do like a more Q&A about it. If you guys have any more questions, leave them in the comments. But if we didn't answer something that you're wondering, or if you're someone who's pregnant or know someone who's pregnant, you have like a question because something we said was similar, let us know. But
like,
if
share,
not,
subscribe. Yeah, like, share, subscribe, drop a comment. You know, again, like Justine said, if you have any questions, feedback, anything at all, we'll always try to address it in the next video or another video.
Yeah, see you next week.
So if you guys want, check out this video right here for if you want to see our first Justine's birth story. So check it out.